Hello everybody, and welcome to this video where I'm going to look at the Conservative Party. This is part of component 1 on UK politics and an important part of the A-level spec. So today we're going to look at several elements of the Conservative Party, its history and some of its policies. So what the specification tells us you need to know. So you need to know the origins, historical and the historical development of the Conservative Party, and in that I'm going to look at 4 different elements. I'm going to look at traditional Conservatives, Nation Conservatives, Thatcherism, and then the kind of the post-Thatcherism era, which is a bit more of a struggle to exactly pin down, as we've had many leaders in a short period of time. We're also then going to look at their current ideas and policies. And so that is kind of shaped by the history of the party, and we'll look at policy areas such as the economy, law and order, welfare and foreign affairs. Now, one of the difficulties with this at the moment is an awful lot of this is difficult to exactly pin down because of the kind of really big events of the last year, notably Brexit and of course the COVID-19 crisis. If we start with traditional conservatism, well, traditional conservatism has its origins in the Tory party of the 17th century and historically is the defender of hierarchy, the ruling elite, monarchy and the Church of England. Now, the Conservative Party itself grew up around Sir Robert Peel, who was Prime Minister 1834 to 5 and also 1841 to 46. And again, this early Conservative Party was a defender of property, opponents of revolution, and what Peel and his supporters pushed for was gradual reform that would preserve and protect the traditional institutions, hence the name the Conservative Party. And this Conservative Party went on to be highly successful in the 19th and 20th centuries. In the latter part of the 19th century, this kind of key thread of conservatism emerged, particularly under the leadership of Benjamin Disraeli, and this is referred to as One Nation Conservatism. So conservatism traditionally was the party of the ruling elite and supported inequality and supported hierarchy. Now, what the Conservatives faced was an increasingly divided nation and new radical ideas such as socialism, and the potential that this gap between rich and poor could cause some real problems. Now, Disraeli's answer to this was something called paternalism. So the idea of this was that the ruling class would look after the interests of the poor through social reform, removing the need for revolution, removing the need for them to turn to radical ideologies like socialism, and help create or maintain a united country, a united nation. Now, this was done through acts like Factory Acts and Artisan Dwelling Acts and Reform Acts, which increased the franchise. And what Disraeli was good at doing, and a lot of the Conservatives then continue this in the later part of the 19th century and through the 20th century, was demonstrating to the wider voters that although this was a party of hierarchy and property, that they were capable of running the country in the interests of the wider population. Another key area that Disraeli championed was the idea of a patriotic or strong or aggressive foreign policy, again that would create a sense of national pride and also bring in shared economic benefit. And we're looking in the period there, the latter half of the 19th century, particularly at an era of colonialism and empire building by the British. Now, One Nation Conservatism continues into the 20th century, and it accepts, first of all, liberal social reform, but then particularly after World War II, accepts Labour's welfare reforms, including the NHS, the shift to Keynesian economics, where the markets were managed by the government to try and make sure the economy was driven towards full employment and to try and mitigate against the kind of the highs and lows that unbridled capitalism can bring. They also accepted the nationalisation of a wide range of industries, in particular the utilities, and they took a pragmatic approach where they continued to mix the free market ideas with some of the Labour policies of state intervention and welfare. So this Conservative Party, again, is very much built on the idea of pragmatism and conserving what is already there, not looking to massively pull back on or remove policies and institutions that have been created, even when they've been created by their opposing party. So again, one nationism under the Conservatives in the middle part of the 20th century, just like Disraeli in the 19th century, are looking to show that they could manage the economy and rule the country on behalf of the nation as a whole, in terms of appealing to all the different groups of people, particularly as we're in a period of universal suffrage. Now, this conservative form of conservatism really kind of fell by the wayside under the leadership of Margaret Thatcher, 1975 through to 1990, winning her first election in 1979 and remaining in power until being toppled by her own MPs in 1990. And what she adopted was a political ideology known as the New Right, which was essentially imported into Britain from America, and where it was used by presidents such as Thatcher's close political friend Ronald Reagan. Now, the main parts of the New Right are a policy of cutting public spending and cutting taxation to try and make the state much smaller, much more streamlined. There's an ideological belief that markets and private industry is better than state-run or state-controlled industry, and so we saw massive privatisation of utilities and other major industries that had previously been under public support. And there was also this idea of introducing competition and markets into areas that remained under state control. So be this league tables for schools, or the introduction of private elements into the NHS, and tendering for contracts, and all kinds of different elements of competition that were brought into the public sector. Margaret Thatcher believed a lot of the problems that Britain had faced in the 1970s were due to the power of the trade unions, and so she sought to crush the unions, which she did very effectively. She also took a very tough line on law and order, particularly when there was mass civil disobedience, for example, with the poll tax riots. And she took, again, what we could be seen as a strong or an aggressive foreign policy. She took a very tough stance with the USSR, earning her the nickname the Iron Lady, and also famously in her time in office there was the Falklands War. Thatcher was a Eurosceptic and aimed to protect British sovereignty against the EU. And again, these are threads which have continued amongst the Conservative Party ever since. So the Thatcherism was an incredibly successful, because it saw winning of elections through 1979, through the 80s and into the 90s. But it was also a divisive and controversial ideology, with kind of the country being divided to an extent between the winners and the losers from this group of policies. So whilst Thatcher will always been seen with great affection and as a really good leader by some, she is definitively not by others. So the post-Thatcherism era. Well, this is again quite a complicated mix. So she's followed by Major, and Major is kind of like he tries to soften Thatcherism, but essentially he maintains a lot of the same ideas. He continues with the privatisation programme. I mean, he tries to reconcile to kind of stop the divide between the Eurosceptic and the pro-European side of his party to fairly limited success, and this kind of argument within the Conservative Party kind of takes over and starts to make them look like a very disunited party, and a less attractive one to the voters. And then from 97, the party went into a kind of period of opposition, and we see a quick turnover of leaders in Hague, Duncan Smith and Howard, and it's difficult to really pin them down in terms of having particularly strong ideological differences or exactly what they would have done, because none of them ever achieved power, which is very unusual for Conservative leaders. So the next Conservative Prime Minister was Cameron, and he talks about the need to detoxify the party from the divisions created by Thatcherism, and described himself as a liberal conservative, and we see with his liberal conservatism, we see a kind of pulling back from the more authoritarian, more traditional family values focus of Thatcherism, and we see policies such as the legalisation of gay marriage. Now, Cameron talked about a return to a kind of a more moderate one nation conservatism, but it was under his governments that following the economic crisis of 2008 that we see all the austerity. So again, we are seeing public sector as being payments being cut back, so the amount of spending in the public sector is being consistently reduced as the government aims to balance its books, which is very much in line with kind of Thatcherite feeling. So although Cameron talks about a new kind of liberal conservatism in terms of a social attitude, it's unclear that really there's a massive movement away from Thatcherism in terms of economic policy. We then have Prime Minister Theresa May. She talked about being strong and stable, though often gave the appearance of being anything but. We get all the Brexit chaos, which is absolutely dominated May's time in office. We see a continuation of the austerity. So again, we're seeing a lot of the old policies and the continuation of Thatcherism there in the background. May had built her reputation as a quite hardline Home Secretary. And then we get on to our current Prime Minister, the current Conservative leader, Boris Johnson. Well, it's difficult to pin much down from Johnson's time in office because we had Brexit followed by COVID-19. So Johnson, again, he fits with a lot of these things that come from the history of the Conservative Party. He is from that ruling elite. He's one of many of the more recent Conservative Prime Ministers who have come from the very, very wealthy elite. So he's one of 5 of the last 12 Conservative Prime Ministers who went to Eton. 9 of the 12 went to top public schools. He's got 2/3 of his cabinet who were privately educated. So we can see the traditional elements of conservatism in there with Johnson. There are definitely some one nation ideas. And he's managed to reach a demographic of voters which Conservative leaders haven't been able to before, particularly in the north of England. We have seen signs of elements of toughness on law and order, which would suggest there's some elements of Thatcherism. The Euroscepticism would definitely give us some elements of Thatcherism as well. It's very difficult at this point to kind of judge Boris's ideological standpoint because he's largely reacting to circumstances, though that kind of reactionary pragmatism is a key element of conservatism through times. As things have changed, the Conservative Party tends to adapt and change with them. So it's really not completely clear what Boris Johnson's ideological standpoint is, and to some extent whether he definitively has one. Now, when looking at the economy, the emphasis in 2019 at the election was on investment projects, for example, things like HS2 rail link between Manchester and Leeds as well. They talk about increasing of the minimum wage. There's no big tax cuts were promised in 2019. There were some plans for some marginal increases in spending, but nothing that would really highlight a complete reversal of austerity, though Johnson has spoken in those terms. Now, all the intentions on the economy have been completely blown out of the water by COVID-19. So, although the government wasn't talking about massive amounts of expenditure, we have seen the hugely expensive furlough scheme being brought in, massive increases required in health spending, handouts required by local councils. So, and the councils and particular areas of the economy like hospitality and the airline industry and travel industry, there's lots of areas of the economy that are calling out for extra support, and there has been some support in lots of areas from the government, but this isn't a normal set of economic policies by a Conservative government, or necessarily what Johnson would have done if there hadn't been this crisis. Most recently, Johnson has been promising to build, and he's almost saying this of like an American-style New Deal, when Roosevelt essentially spent America's way out of the Depression in the 1930s. To talk about it in that terms has been seen in the media as a gross exaggeration, because we're not talking in terms of scale of GDP. We're not talking an enormous amount at the moment, and what we'll have to wait and see is what this turns into, and what the economic ramifications really are of this crisis that we're in the middle of. In terms of law and order, there's been recent talk about an increase in the growth of prison capacity, and Priti Patel has certainly taken a tough line regarding social disorder during COVID-19. She's been highly critical of the Black Lives Matters protests and the pulling down of the statue in Bristol and the dumping it in the harbour. In terms of other stuff that's coming out of the Home Office, we've seen the introduction of the tighter immigration system, using kind of an Australian-style point-based system. Exactly who this is going to mean can and cannot come in is unclear, and again, with the ongoing crises and the stuff over Brexit is exactly unclear exactly who and why the people will be coming into the country, and scales of policing and things like that have also been unclear. So stuff about the Home Office, there's been some developments, but again, it's something we probably need slightly calmer times to see a full grasp of what's going on in terms of the ideas of the party. In terms of welfare, the Conservative Party continues with its hugely controversial universal credit. Again, this has been dogged by controversies and hold-ups, and there's a huge amount that's been written about the amount of hardship it has created, particularly with delays in payment. There's announced an end of the freeze in benefits, which means there will be an increase in the amount of money people get, but it's only at 1.7%. And again, we're talking about a whole new scale of people on welfare because of the unemployment created by the COVID-19 crisis. There's the triple lock with pensions, which the Conservative government committed themselves in 2019. Again, the affordability of this has only recently been questioned given the current circumstances. But this should guarantee a 2.5% increase in pensions year on year, or higher if inflation or wages are increasing at a higher rate. Johnson has promised to fix the adult social care crisis, and people not having to sell their houses to pay for it, but exactly how it's going to be paid for, again, is very, very unclear. So with welfare, COVID-19 has kind of opened a whole new scale of an issue in terms of unemployment and crises in various sectors. And again, how the government deals with all of this might give us a bit more of an insight into their ideological position and change or continuity with the Conservative past. Again, in foreign affairs, it's kind of been a bit overshadowed by everything else that's been going on. So it dominated by the leaving of the EU and this kind of absolute commitment that will be no delay, even if that means leaving on no deal. The government will then be seeking to make new trade deals. There seems to be a suggestion that we're looking at a closer relationship with America and with President Trump. And we've seen in recent days a tough line being taken towards China over the crisis in Hong Kong. So again, it's all part of in development, and Johnson's not been in power for a huge length of time. So these things will develop, and this will be something you need to be keeping a close eye on. Right, I hope all that's been helpful. Thank you very much for watching. Please remember to like, to comment, and to subscribe. With everything with politics, as soon as I make this video, bits of it are going to go out of date, not the history of the Conservative Party, but what you will need to keep a close eye on is all those developments in terms of those key policy areas: welfare, economy, foreign policy, law and order, and where the Conservative Party continue to sit on that. And that is something that is likely to develop in the time of Johnson's in power, and something that you might be writing about in a very different way in 1 or 2 years' time, depending on where you are in the A-level politics course. Right, thank you very much for watching.